One of the things that really strikes me is it is an unheard story, right? I want to know how you came to the story, and then, most importantly, I want to know, did it change your perception of Duke Ellington as you learned about it?
Yeah, those are great questions. So I came to the story. My company was performing in New York at the Brooklyn Academy of Music in 1999, way back then. And there was a commercial Broadway producer in the audience. And so he came up to me afterwards and said, I have this musical written by a guy named Billy Strayhorn and Luther Henderson. And a friend of Billy Strayhorn's, Lena Horne, gave it to me years ago, and so now I'm trying to find someone to complete this musical because it was unfinished. We actually mentioned Rose-Colored Glasses in the text. That was the musical that was brought to me by this producer, and I had never heard of Billy Strayhorn, and I thought, who is Billy Strayhorn? And of course, once I looked into it, I realized I knew all of his music, right. Lush Life, A-Train, and a biography of Billy Strayhorn called Lush Life by a gentleman named David Hadu had just come out then. And so I read the biography and fell in love with the story of Billy Strayhorn. And then, so I worked on Rose-Colored Glasses for about maybe 2.5 years for a lot of different reasons. We went through a couple of workshop productions. We had it up and running, but it didn't go to Broadway. It was an amazing experience on every level, but I always thought I'll come back to Billy Strayhorn's music and to his life, which were the two things that were the most resonant for me, but do it on my own terms as a piece for my company. And so all these years later, I returned about 4 years ago to Strayhorn's music, but I came to know him through Rose-Colored Glasses, and I actually fell in love with him and his life and what it represented right away.
And did it change your perception of Duke Ellington, or just the, the narrative?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I didn't know that. I knew Duke Ellington's music really well. I didn't know him that well, and I would say that it probably didn't change my perspective that much, except that it's more than valid to give Strayhorn his due in terms of the work that he wrote and co-wrote. I would say that that Duke Ellington doesn't, in my mind, come across as a beast or really evil, but famously, he's a narcissist. I think all of his biographies have said he's a larger-than-life figure, a famous narcissist. Those are not, many artists are narcissists, right. So you had this grand personality, and he ran the publishing house. It was publishing all the music that they wrote together.
So he had
but his first job, oh my gosh, I want to say with Irving Berlin, but I could be wrong. His music, that was kind of the way that publishing was done in those days.
Right.
The arranger versus the composer. And so he actually left and started working on his own with his own publishing house because he was Duke Ellington, because he was having issues around rights. So he was. So
it was the way of the business.
Exactly.
Of the year. And
exactly.
It hasn't changed very much.
Exactly. But he had a really large personality, and he loved Billy Strayhorn like a brother. He was 100% accepting of who Billy Strayhorn was. Billy Strayhorn was relentlessly and always optimistic and smiling. He had the cheery personality. Some would say to a flaw, or that he was covering up an internal sadness. And there's the question that everyone asks about Billy Strayhorn. Did he realize that he wasn't getting credit for his music? How did it affect him inside? And he always said, not at all. I'm very comfortable with my relationship with Ellington, always really cheery. But then the musicians around him started to describe an inner turmoil that became more and more obvious, whether it was the fact that he was gay or the fact that his professional relationship maybe wasn't all that he had hoped, and the public presence. And he also drank and smoked himself to death, which is a sign that all is not, that this smiley face was maybe hiding
the mask.
Inner turmoil, exactly. So the sad clown refers to that, smiling on the outside, but sad on the inside.
Can you both tell me a little bit about the process of building this work? Because it's so complex and layered, and it's so difficult to do multimedia well, where it's very balanced, and I think that it is extraordinarily balanced. I mean, for me, down to the font that you chose for the words is incredible. That's just me. I get into stuff like that. But so I love, it's sort of a chicken and egg. So can you tell me a little bit about how you arrived at this, both as filmmaker and choreographer?
David and I have been working together for a long time, so that has something to do with it. And we had done a production called Stardust that was all text. And I had done a lot of text over the years, and I was tired of typing text. And so David came to me with this piece, and he's like, there's a lot of text. I was like, I don't want to type text anymore. And so I said, I have this idea. I'll just handwrite all the text.
That's your handwriting.
It was a really bad idea. But I love it. I love how it came out. And yeah, we really wanted something that spoke to the time and the era and the fact that, you know, these notes were written and it just harkened that feeling that we were after. So that was a huge process to go through. And took many hours, and we had many changes, and
Rewrite it.
yeah.
So did the script, if you will, come first, and then if you work on material, or how do you put that together? And did the film come last, or just give me a sense of the order?
David generally works with a script, which is really helpful for me as a filmmaker. It makes sense to me, it translates well. So there was that to sink my claws into. And then we always talk about the ideas and the concepts and metaphors. And then we come up collectively with visual metaphors that make sense. And David came to me with the clown, and I showed up with some of the other ones. So we kind of meet in the middle. But we just talk a lot about the ideas and then arrive at the visuals.
Yeah, and this piece in particular, so it started with Stardust, actually with, mostly with Stardust, that the relationship between the text and the movement and the visual imagery is somewhat different than it is in some of my other works, meaning that trying to be really careful that the dancing not act out the text, and that the film not narrate the text, which is already narrative. And so what Cari Ann and I did was really discussed all the emotional textures of the piece. That's the uniting factor, is the subtext, the emotional tones, the undercurrents, the dramatic and emotional undercurrent of Strayhorn's journey are what unites the movement. And the visual imagery and the text. And Cari Ann was really great about, we would talk about what some of those darker and lighter and brighter colors are, and then she would come up with images that illustrated maybe not the narrative, but those emotional
But the subtext,
undercurrents.
right.
Exactly.
Let's talk about the movement. It captures the ease and the coolness of the era, with the use of social dance, but it's not. But it's hinted at times, and it's overlaid with the contemporary vernacular. And the other thing that that really struck me is that your dancer, there's such an ease to the way that they perform it. It looks so natural and organic, not of this era, but of that era. And you know how sometimes it can look pushed, like they're trying to affect the era, but it just looks so at home and natural. And I'm wondering if that's a byproduct of that. Is it a byproduct of your process or the movement itself, or?
Yeah. This piece, when we first started making it, so I was a jazz dancer in my hometown of Houston way back when, and my father was a jazz musician. He's a saxophone player from New Orleans. And so whether it's in the DNA or early training, rhythm and polyrhythms and jazz, that was my background before I moved to New York. I was interested in musical theater and jazz, and then started with postmodern and modern dance later in life after I graduated from college. And so right when I started working with this music, I decided not to judge what the vocabulary wanted to be. And even before I wrote the text, usually I write the text first and then the movement hangs off the text. This was kind of the reverse, that we started with music and movement and wanted to develop a movement vocabulary that felt organic and that could excavate Strayhorn's life from this music. And right away I started working with strong influences from jazz and social dance than I had in the most recent pieces. There was a really conscious decision right there at the beginning to just go with that. And in particular, the jazz references, which in many cases are social dance references, and just to let those exist within the piece. It's all, there are some bouts of improvisation for sure, and then everything else is rigidly counted. It feels like the rhythmic base is what unites all the different form references. And early in the piece, I just decided that this was going to be more of a jazz-based piece, and that we were going to let that really affect the postmodernism of the work.